On July 24th, 1847, a man dying of mountain fever looked down from his wagon at a desolate valley surrounded by mountains. The temperature was over 100 degrees. There were no trees, no water except a poisonous salt lake that killed everything it touched. The soil was alkaline and barren. The nearest settlement was over 1,000 miles away. And this man, Brigham Young, leader of the Mormon Church, pointed to this wasteland and said 7 words that would change American history. This is the right place. Drive on. Within 3 years, 20,000 people were living in that desert. Within 10 years, they had built irrigation systems more sophisticated than anything in North America. Within 20 years, Salt Lake City had roads, schools, a university, a massive temple, and an economy that rivaled San Francisco. They did not just survive in the desert. They built a civilization in a place where survival should have been impossible. And the reason they chose that specific location, the most inhospitable valley they could find, tells you everything you need to know about what happens when a community is pushed to the absolute edge and refuses to die. For the next 8 minutes, I'm going to show you why the Mormons were the most hated religious group in 1840s America, what happened in the 2 years before they reached the desert that forced them to choose between exile or extinction, how Brigham Young turned starvation and death into a coordinated engineering miracle, and what the desert city they built reveals about human resilience when there is no backup plan and no way back. This is not religious history. This is survival history. And it is one of the most extraordinary examples of civilization building under impossible conditions in the modern world. Now, let me start with why they were running, because you cannot understand the decision to settle a desert without understanding what they were running from. The Mormons, officially the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, were founded in 1830 by Joseph Smith in upstate New York. Smith claimed he had received golden plates from an angel containing a new scripture, the Book of Mormon, which described Jesus Christ visiting ancient America. This was not just a new denomination. This was a claim that God had given new revelation, that the Bible was incomplete, and that Smith was a prophet equal to Moses or Muhammad. Christians across America saw this as heresy. Mormons were driven out of New York, then Ohio, then Missouri. In Missouri, the governor issued an extermination order in 1838, stating that all Mormons must be killed or expelled from the state. That is not an exaggeration. The official order used the word exterminated. Mormons fled to Illinois and built a city called Nauvoo, which became the largest city in Illinois by 1844 with a population of 12,000. They had their own militia, their own courts, and growing political power. Joseph Smith even announced he was running for president of the United States. Then in June 1844, a mob stormed the jail where Joseph Smith was being held on charges of treason and shot him to death. The founder of Mormonism was murdered by American citizens while in government custody. And the question facing the Mormons was simple: stay and face systematic extermination, or leave the United States entirely. Brigham Young, who took over leadership after Smith's death, made the decision. They would leave. Not just leave Illinois, leave the United States, go so far into the wilderness that no government could reach them and no mob could follow. They would find a place so hostile that no one else wanted it, and they would make it theirs. Now let me show you the journey, because this was not a casual migration. This was the largest organized civilian movement in American history up to that point. In February 1846, the first Mormon wagons crossed the frozen Mississippi River and headed west. Over the next 18 months, 16,000 Mormons walked over 1,300 miles from Illinois to the Great Salt Lake Valley. They walked through winter blizzards, summer heat, and across plains with no roads and no supply stations. Hundreds died of cholera, starvation, and exhaustion, but they kept moving because the alternative was death at the hands of mobs. Brigham Young was not just a religious leader, he was a logistics genius. He organized the exodus like a military campaign. The migrants were divided into companies of 100 families each, with captains responsible for discipline and supply management. Scouts went ahead to map routes and identify water sources. Blacksmiths, carpenters, and farmers were distributed across companies to ensure each group had necessary skills. This was not a panicked flight. This was a planned colonization of territory that did not yet belong to the United States. When the first company reached the Salt Lake Valley in July 1847, they found exactly what the scouts had reported: a desert. The Great Salt Lake was 6 times saltier than the ocean. Nothing grew on its shores. The valley received less than 15 inches of rain per year. The soil was hard clay mixed with salt deposits. The nearest timber was in mountains miles away, and winter temperatures dropped below zero. This was a place designed by nature to remain empty. Brigham Young chose it for exactly that reason. No one else would want it, which meant no one would chase them for it. Here is where the miracle begins. Within days of arrival, Young laid out the city grid. Streets were to be 132 feet wide, wider than any city in America, to allow a wagon and team of oxen to turn around without reversing. Every block was 10 acres, divided into 8 lots. Water rights were assigned by the church. and the rule was absolute. Water belonged to the community, not individuals. This was necessary because the only way to survive in a desert is collective management of the one resource that determines life or death. The first task was irrigation. The Mormons diverted streams from the mountains into a network of canals and ditches that brought water to every farm plot. This was not primitive irrigation. This was engineering. They built dams, aqueducts, and reservoir systems that controlled water flow with precision. Within 1 year, they had 5,000 acres under cultivation growing wheat, corn, and vegetables. Within 5 years, they had over 16,000 acres irrigated. This was the largest irrigation project in North America at the time, built by hand, with shovels, by people who had been starving the year before. But irrigation alone was not enough. The soil was alkaline, which kills most crops. The Mormons had to amend the soil by adding organic matter, manure, and gypsum to neutralize the salt. They experimented with crops until they found varieties that could tolerate the conditions. They brought seeds from all over the world, grapes from France, mulberry trees from China, fruit trees from California. They did not just survive. They turned the desert into farmland that produced surplus food within 3 years of arrival. Now let me show you the genius of Brigham Young's economic system, because this is what turned survival into prosperity. Young banned private property and water, and required all major economic projects to be organized collectively. If the community needed a sawmill, the church assigned men to build it, and everyone shared the output. If the community needed a road, everyone worked on it. This was not socialism in the political sense. This was survival pragmatism. In a desert with no resources and no external support, you either cooperate or you die. There is no room for individual profit-seeking when the baseline is starvation. Young also controlled immigration. He sent missionaries to Europe to recruit converts with specific skills. They needed miners, so they recruited Welsh coal miners. They needed engineers, so they recruited British railroad workers. They needed farmers who knew dry land agriculture, so they recruited Swiss and Scandinavian immigrants. Every wave of new arrivals was selected to fill gaps in the labor force. This was planned population growth optimized for survival. And here's the most remarkable part. They built a temple, not a small church, a massive granite temple that took 40 years to complete. They started construction in 1853 when the city was only 6 years old and people were still struggling to grow enough food. The foundation stones weighed several tons each and had to be hauled from a quarry 20 miles away. Why build a temple when you are barely surviving? Because the temple was the statement. It said, "We are not refugees passing through. We are building a permanent civilization. This is our home. And we will not be driven out again." Now let me address the controversial parts because understanding the Mormon achievement requires honesty about the costs. The Mormons practiced polygamy, one man marrying multiple women, which was deeply offensive to mainstream Christian America, and eventually forced the church to abandon the practice in 1890 as a condition for Utah statehood. They also had conflicts with Native American tribes whose land they occupied. The Mormons initially tried peaceful coexistence, but as more settlers arrived and resources became scarce, violence erupted. The worst incident was the Mountain Meadows Massacre in 1857 when Mormon militiamen killed over 100 non-Mormon migrants passing through Utah. This was not self-defense. This was murder. Brigham Young's involvement remains debated, but it happened under his leadership. These are not minor details. They are part of the historical record. The Mormon achievement in the desert is real, but it was not bloodless and it was not morally pure. Like every civilization-building project in history, it involved violence, exploitation, and decisions that prioritize the survival of the in-group over the rights of others. That does not erase the achievement, but it does require acknowledging the full cost. So why does this matter now? Because the Salt Lake City story is the clearest modern example of a principle that applies to every civilization that has ever endured. When a group has no fallback and no external support, they either innovate or they die. The Mormons had no government aid. They had no trade partners. They had no wealthy donors. They had a desert, a leader with a vision, and the absolute necessity of making it work. And that necessity unlocked capabilities that would never have emerged in comfortable conditions. The irrigation systems they built became the model for all future desert agriculture in the American West. The city planning principles they used, wide streets, communal water management, mixed-use zoning, influenced urban design across the western United States. And the cultural legacy of collective survival shaped Mormon communities in ways that still exist today. High rates of volunteerism, strong community networks, and an emphasis on self-reliance combined with mutual aid. But the deeper lesson is this: geography is not destiny. The Salt Lake Valley was objectively one of the worst places in North America to build a city. It should have been impossible. The fact that it worked was not because of divine intervention or natural advantages. It worked because a highly motivated, well-organized group with competent leadership and no alternative options made it work. They did not conquer the desert. They negotiated with it. They learned its rules. And they built a system that turned its harshest features isolation, aridity, extreme temperatures, into advantages that protected them from the persecution they had fled. Every successful civilization in history has faced a version of this choice: adapt to impossible conditions or disappear. The Mormons adapted. And in doing so, they created something that outlasted the mobs that tried to destroy them, the government that tried to control them, and the desert that should have killed them. That is not a religious miracle. That is a human achievement. And it is one of the most compelling survival stories in modern history. I will continue exploring how civilizations survive impossible conditions, what leadership looks like when there is no room for failure, and the patterns that determine which communities endure and which ones collapse. Subscribe. Share this with someone who appreciates stories of human resilience, and I will see you in the next one.